we are shining a light on one of the greatest figures in American history. Born Araminta Ross, she began her life in bondage, later escaping to become a conductor on the Underground Railroad, and one of the most important figures in the fight for abolition. So, in this episode, we are going to discuss her life, her work, and her legacy as I ask, who is Harriet Tubman? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. Joining us from our faculty is Professor Rebecca Fraser, a historian of 19th century America with a particular interest in the history of African Americans, especially relating to their resistance against slavery and the enslaved experience. Welcome back, Becky.
Hello, I'm very, very pleased to be back and delighted to be talking about Harriet Tubman today on this particular episode.
Yes, really good to have you back. It feels like it's been far too long. And congratulations are in order as well, because since your last appearance, you're now professor, or about to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So become professor on the 1st of August, I believe it is. And thank you very much. It's a really nice way to end the academic year.
Yes, it's incredible news, and I take full credit for your success now. And we're also delighted to be joined on the podcast today by a pioneering historian of American women, the American South, and the Civil War. She's published over 30 books, including Harriet Tubman, Road to Freedom, which we'll put a link to in the show notes. She's a professor of history at the UTSA, which is the University of Texas in San Antonio. But she's currently on a research fellowship in France. So a big bonjour to Catherine Clinton.
Bonjour, Liam, but I have zipped over to London, and I'm very pleased to be on your podcast because it's important now for us to look back in American history as we're having American history made, and I'm pleased again to be here in the UK during historic times as well. So thank you very much for inviting me on the program.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've picked quite a time to be in Europe and in France. It's all happening politically. We're giving America a bit of a run for its money at the moment.
I would say the headlines are popping back and forth across the Atlantic, but I was very pleased because I do try and keep up with the American historians. And of course, I met Becky very early on at a conference, and it's really a pleasure to meet up with her virtually, as well as I'm attending the Society of American Historians conference at Oxford on July 5th. I think when they planned the program, they didn't understand that people might have election hangover on the day of the conference. But we will forge forward, and I'm very pleased to be joining you today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. And on the subject of election hangovers, I've very foolishly arranged another recording of the podcast on Friday morning, which kind of puts paid to my plans to stay up all night and watch the UK election coverage. But hey, that's the sacrifice we make. But anyway, Harriet Tubman. Catherine, I'd really like to come to you first because, I think when anyone that knows anything about Harriet Tubman probably thinks about the work that she did sort of post-slavery. But tell us a bit about her early life. Who was she and what was her enslaved experience like?
Well, as an enslaved person, we, of course, don't really have her birth date. There were no announcements sent out like most of the enslaved people born before the Civil War. There is a great deal of murky history about when she was born. I have pinpointed the date by later documents and say that she was born Araminta to her parents, Ben and Harriet Ross, in 1825. And she lived a life in Maryland, a border state where slavery was a part of the southwestern trade, but also a part of the agricultural bounty. So she was raised as a person who would be working in the fields upon adulthood. As a child, she was sent out to child mind in other people's homes. And we know from the age of 6, she was actually put to work. And this was the hard life of the enslaved child. She later went into the fields where she felt she had more independence, and it also gave her a sense of purpose to be working with her brothers, to be working under the supervision often of her father. So there were times, I think, when the family and religious aspects of her early life were uplifting. At the same time, we know the brutality and harshness of slavery during the antebellum era was a stain upon our history.
And Becky, I wonder if you could shed some light on, what we know about Harriet's sort of experience as a slave. What was it like relative to other slaves? Because obviously every enslaved experience was awful, and I think maybe it's good to just understand it kind of relative to others.
Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult to really kind of quantify each and every the experiences of enslaved people, primarily because each one was very, very different. Depending on your enslaver, the type of work that you did, the brutality meted out by overseers and such like. But I think thinking about Harriet's experiences and being comparable, I think possibly it's comparable in the sense that many enslaved peoples, whether they were children or adults, were subject to the sale or a division on the death of the enslaver. So Joseph Brodus, who was the enslaver of her mother and siblings and herself, dies, and sort of his widow Mary inherits his enslaved peoples, and then she marries Anthony Thompson, and so this kind of division of enslaved peoples through allotting them after an enslaver's death, and many times enslavers after their death had to put them up for sale, primarily to recoup the debts that they were in. So I think that's pretty similar. The domestic slave trade, which her several of her siblings, particularly her 2 sisters, were subject to, was a familiar story for many enslaved peoples from sort of childhood upwards. Mike Tadman, the renowned historian, suggests that from 1820 to 1860 the trade averaged over 200,000 enslaved peoples per year, and so that's 10% of enslaved people sold from the Upper South to the markets of the Lower South. So sort of it's pretty sizable, and there were trading categories, particularly your young prime adult males, young mothers with children. It ended in a kind of, it resulted in a trade in kind of fragmented families, right? So sort of enslaved families were separated up. But on the kind of the positive side, if we can draw anything positive out of the enslaved experience, is that actually Rit and Ben, so her mother, Harriet, known as Rit, and Ben, her father, they managed to kind of stay relatively together, right? So, and they had possibly 11 children, so we're not exactly sure of how many children, but possibly 11. And Harriet and her siblings managed to stay as a family unit for all, sort of intents and purposes. So, and even though Harriet was subject to hiring out from a very, very young age, it's testimony to the resilience of enslaved peoples that Harriet and Ben, her mother and father, managed to, sort of stay, sort of relatively intact and, raise their children as best they could within the conditions that they found themselves in.
Catherine, I'll come to you because, Becky mentioned a lot of the experience that Harriet had were quite universal amongst slaves. There was, a lot of sort of shared sort of life events, I guess, that Harriet had that a lot of other slaves have. Do you think perhaps the fact that her family stayed relatively intact, was that a big deal in terms of instilling that desire, that hope for something better? Because it's kind of one of those things that, slave overseers and slaveholders, they don't like slaves to know what freedom could be like, because it gives them that drive to want freedom. And I guess I'm trying to understand what was it that happened to Harriet that kind of gave her that impetus to chase freedom where other slaves didn't.
Well, I would say her family was a very big part of it. And we know from the early escapes that she made and the returns to the South to bring enslaved people northward to freedom were family members. So we know that she had this very driven ideal of freedom for all, but began, of course, with her closest relatives. We also know that in trying to aid another slave who had left the field early, she had seen that the overseer was angry and was going to find him, and she ran ahead and tried to warn him as he was at a little country store near the home plantation, and the angry overseer threw a lead weight which struck Harriet, and she was felled, and she was really, it was thought to be fatally wounded, and for many days and nights her mother prayed over her body. She, at that point, I think, really resolved that she would have her freedom or die. She was really someone who had visions. She was someone who was deeply religious and spoke directly to God about her freedom. And I think people often question, how did she manage to be so, as an illiterate who never learned to read and write, how could she do all this? And I say she was incredibly clever. She had incredible guile, and she used it. She was very, very able to use the woods, to use the sky in order to travel, to make her way, to disguise herself. She was someone who was incredibly resourceful, and therefore we know that she was nerved by right. She believed in freedom, and she did not really believe that there would be a government rescue of the enslaved through emancipation. That was something we have directly in testimony from her before the war. But once the war began, she adopted, and she did adopt the phrase, I think from John Brown, that slavery is war. And therefore, she saw it really as she was a warrior to free her people. And that is how I think she came by the name Moses.
That's going to take us nicely on to that sort of legacy that she left behind and the work that she did when she escaped. But Becky, tell me about that journey, though, to actually securing her freedom. What options are there for slaves trying to break free, and how did Harriet do it?
Well, I mean, sort of options are, limited really for enslaved peoples wanting to self-emancipate, so i.e. run away. And they would be very often faced with challenges of distance, traveling on foot, traveling through very, very hostile, territories, not only in relation to being chased or hunted down by slave catchers and packs of dogs, but also facing the dangers of wading through rivers, swampland and forests, whereby they might face dangers in terms of getting bitten by snakes, etc. So it was really, really hostile. And I think I'm just I love hearing Catherine talk about the ways in which Harriet gained her freedom, and I'm reminded so much of what she wrote in her brilliant book. She was just a phenomenal woman, an intellectual. I mean, I've classed her as a black female intellectual within work that I've done, and I think because she was illiterate, many people have kind of dismissed her as an intellectual, and actually to use your wit and your ingenuity and to navigate your way, not just once to Philadelphia, where she crosses that line as a free state, but also to go back at least 13 times to help others in that journey to freedom. It really was just a courageous thing to do, and like Catherine, I think she decides from a very, very early age it's liberty or death, right? The old Patrick Henry type adage of I will be free or I will die. And thinking about what Catherine said about, sort of she was a warrior. Yeah, absolutely. And of course she was very, very close to John Brown, and she was there in terms of his early discussions around the raid on Harper's Ferry, and sort of raising an army of liberated enslaved peoples. And John Brown called her General Tubman. I think Tubman's journeys to freedom were immense. But of course, sort of they weren't the only ways in which enslaved peoples could become free. The enslaver themselves might emancipate enslaved peoples in their lifetime, but more probably in their wills. But that was increasingly difficult to do. Slave states in the American South started to impose legislation around emancipated enslaved peoples not remaining in the state, right? So Emily West has written some wonderful material scholarship around this, and so as slave states were kind of worried, paranoid that once emancipated, freed enslaved peoples would then start sort of helping others to, sort of emancipate themselves or escape, or and they were, sort of this was a kind of a paranoia, and of course, sort of based on Harriet Tubman's trajectory, they did, but I think that the fact that slave states begin to develop this legislation sort of mid antebellum era, I think it's a real sign of the fact that they are growing ever worried and nervous about the number of sort of enslaved peoples who are on a quest for liberty, right?
And Harriet Tubman was clearly a big part of that. And Catherine, you mentioned that she saw herself as a warrior, and you've both used that sort of language around this being a war and a battle. Was it always her intention to go back and help other people, do you think, or did that journey sort of, I guess, change something in her?
Well, I think going into Philadelphia and seeing William Still and his community, that she, nerve by right, decided to become an abductor. That is the term used at the time. We don't use it in modern scholarship because it has other kind of connotations. We use the term conductor, meaning that they had their own language within the Underground Railroad. They had depots, they had safe stations, they had an entire network. And she was both entranced by the network that she encountered when she went to Philadelphia, but also, I think even more importantly, she could not believe the Black community in Philadelphia. She saw people reading, writing, society, libraries, public spaces occupied by Black and white. Although it was an incredibly challenging city, it nevertheless offered opportunities that were just not there in the South, as assembly laws, and as Rebecca's pointing out, as the clamp down in the South, the fear of runaways. Income was being lost. Insurance was being paid for chattel property. We look at especially the decade after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in the 50s, which is really when Tubman began her conductor career, and we see indeed chaos. We also see that there were some conductors on the railroad, people helping slaves to safety, who were caught and were put in jail. And therefore, Tubman was indeed endangering herself and saw herself as on a very holy mission. And she frequently would go into the office of Thomas Garrett in Delaware or into William Still, and she would explain to them that she needed money to go on rescue missions, because she would even take an assignment to go south and rescue someone. As we say, the brutality of slavery was extreme, but I can also say labor was exploited during that period, and there may be just as extreme exploitation of immigrants. However, the sale of children, the separation of families, was a distinctive factor for slavery. And also, enslaved women were subject to what I call the first and worst hostile work environment in American history. They were subject to sexual predators. We know from work through the WPA narratives that 18% of those members who gave testimony about slavery talked about the sexual exploitation of enslaved women. Several of us biographers have even detailed the possibility that Harriet herself may have been a victim of sexual exploitation, which may explain her later rescue of a mixed race child who she brought to freedom in Auburn, where, by the way, she had been able to establish her family prior to the Civil War. She reconstituted her mother, her father, her brothers, and it was really and sisters-in-law, it was really, and children. She was really someone who had a vision, and those visions she wanted to realize, and therefore she became really, I think, ennobled by what she saw as the cause of Black freedom. We know, for example, that she was the mistress of the large escape, and we have a record where she once took 11 people out of slavery. Now, I have some debates with those who write children's books and other folkloric aspects, because they often describe Harriet as carrying a rifle, which she did do during the Civil War. But she did not carry around a rifle trying to be a clandestine conductor on the Underground Railway. However, we know that, for example, she settled in a home, and we believe it was Frederick Douglass's home, because he often brought people in and they slept on the rugs on their way to safety in Canada. And she established herself in St. Catharines in Canada, her family, but came back to Auburn really under the good auspices of William Seward's friendship, giving her a mortgage, allowing her. So here she had a dream, and she indeed was one of the African Americans who was able to realize that dream. I mean, we only really emphasize it because it's such a remarkable story. There are other stories of the Crafts. There are other stories of Henry Box Brown, who put himself in a box and shipped himself to freedom. But those are few and far between. At the same time, I'm always amazed by people who say that the owners wanted to keep the slaves from knowing about freedom. I mean, certainly they lived, they breathed, they saw families. Especially enslaved women were required to tend to the children of white owners. They knew what privilege a family life was. And that was something that Harriet really moved forward on. I think one of the saddest stories is, of course, that when she returned to her family, she found that her husband, who was a free Black, John Tubman, had abandoned her and remarried. And that was something, I think, he was unwilling to go with her to freedom. He spent his life there. But she did believe that they had a religious bond, and it's important to note that she never remarried until after he died, shortly after the Civil War. But she nevertheless made a new family, struck out for freedom, and brought others to freedom in various states. She took them to Canada once it was feared that they might be recaptured and returned. As Becky was saying, the slave catchers who came north were notorious. She was involved in a rescue in Troy, New York, of a man named Charles Knoll. He was being sought by his mixed race half brother that the master had sent him. She dressed herself up in a shawl and a little basket and went like a sweet old lady to the courtroom, and then whipped off the shawl, took him down the stairs, took him across the river, and Knoll was on his way to freedom. So she was an intrepid person who believed that every enslaved person had a right to freedom.
And I think that's the thing, isn't it? That she's courageous, right? I mean, it is really kind of liberty or death. But, the fact that she doesn't escape slavery and then say, right, I'm going to work from the north, the northern states, where I am, sort of to all intents and purposes regarded as free, despite the Fugitive Slave Act that is passed in 1850. She goes back. And she goes back so many times. I mean, like, just, sort of with a kind of bounty on her head, wanted dead or alive, right? And the bravery, the courageous nature of Harriet Tubman really has to, sort of stand head and shoulders above, sort of everything else. And so yeah, so I think and of course, you know, sort of Catherine's already sort of mentioned her relationship with John Tubman, her husband, and you know, sort of how I think actually distraught she is when she finds out that, you know, sort of he has forsaken her and taken another wife. I mean, and maybe that kind of reinforces her kind of, you know, sort of inclination and, you know, sort of passion to, you know, sort of be free at any cost, and, you know, sort of to go and save, and to go back and, you know, sort of and guide other family members out of enslavement.
And you know, it's incredible. Like, her story is just absolutely incredible. But it is one of many, as you say, Catherine, that you know, every path to freedom was a dangerous one. But the Underground Railroad did provide some sort of system and an escape route for slaves, at scale, I guess, versus other means of trying to escape. And now this is going to be a silly question, but it's one I'm sure some of my listeners might also have. What is the Underground Railroad? Are we actually talking trains and carts here? How did this actually work?
Well, it's so interesting that the great granddaughter of a Black civil rights leader was on the Real Housewives of Atlanta, and she started talking about the railroad. Apparently, she didn't understand the concept that it was not a real railway underground, although we do have modern, fantastic Pulitzer Prize winning novels that might say that. At the same time, it was a network, it was a clandestine network, and they used the language of mobility, the railroad being the greatest mobility. And indeed, everything had to be secret, and everyone had to travel usually by night, traveling by the night stars, etc. But I do want to say that the rescue of enslaved people was something that many people know about her career on the Underground Railroad. I think many fewer know about her role in the Civil War. And that is something that I think the new literature has been able to emphasize, and particularly two wonderful books that have come out this year, 20 years after I wrote my book. Etta Fields Black and Taya Miles have both written about Harriet and her fight for freedom, that in one single night, the Combahee River raid, over 700 slaves were rescued by her on Union gunboats. And this kind of clandestine was, I think, the Underground Railroad coming above ground and really being an amazing phenomenon. But of course, the running away of so many enslaved people caused the Union government to have to create contraband and contraband camps, and eventually in 1863, the enlistment of African American soldiers. And many women participated in this liberation. Many Black women were enslaved people. As early as the 1960s, James McPherson, in his book, quote, The Negro Civil War, talked about the clandestine work of African American women during the Civil War with secrets and signals, and laundresses in camps in the Confederate camps could spread information. So I think we're really recovering in the 21st century the lives of Black women during the 19th century who were not just spies and warriors, but also living their lives, making it possible for others to gain their freedom. We also don't know as much as we need to know about Tubman's later career as a suffragist, as a reformer, as a humanitarian, which she championed so many of these causes during her post-war career in Auburn, New York.
I'm keen to touch on this because, you know, we've discussed when we've talked about the civil rights movement on the podcast a couple of times. We discussed Martin Luther King and how actually at the time that he was at his sort of peak and doing most of his work, he wasn't a very popular guy, which was kind of, I guess, the point. Like, he was fighting for change and he was fighting for something that the system didn't particularly want, and white people didn't really like him. Is the same sort of true to an extent for Harriet Tubman and other slaves who were doing the work that they were doing? And, you know, was there hostility towards them even amongst, you know, unionists, for instance?
I do really think that we have to get back to this issue of how much she contributed when she went to the Auburn community. She was so respected there. And I will say that I have made the claim in my book that she was the first African American woman to have a public memorial. That the year she died, the city of Auburn put a plaque up on the county courthouse. It was dedicated by one of her descendants, and also Booker T. Washington came to town. So I think she was someone who was quite beloved in her own way. Yet she is so, I say, not unlike Abraham Lincoln, plastique, and has this capacity. So in later years, she's adopted by the clandestine domestic abuse underground railroad that develops in North America. There are Harriet Tubman stops and women trying to escape brutal situations, and they have to do it in a clandestine way. I also say that the Black Panthers used her as a symbol of resistance during that period. And I also know when the Victoria and Albert Museum was celebrating the end of the slave trade, the British slave trade, they had many installations, and one of them was Harriet Tubman in a black cab going around rescuing people. So she has this capacity of really being seen, I think, more widely. And to say, was there hostility during her own day? I think she avoided a lot of that because Harriet Tubman was a woman of action, whereas Frederick Douglass was a man of many words. So I think that he, through his newspaper, his speeches, attracted this kind of controversy, whereas Tubman herself was quietly working in her own community to promote the homeless. She opened a home for the indigent and for the veteran. She married a veteran. She was someone who had the only care facility for Blacks outside of New York City in the entire state of New York. So her legacy was one, I think, of healing and bringing people together, which made her quite distinctive during that period.
Yeah, so which also runs throughout her whole life, right? So her whole quest was to, sort of bring her family to safety, right? But I would also add to that brilliant analysis that she dies, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine, but in relative poverty, right? So, sort of, and I think Catherine mentioned earlier that, these rescue missions cost money to go back to guide others to freedom, and she's constantly asking people like William Still to sort of sponsor her, or sort of, and she's taking odd jobs here and there, and she's baking and selling the home baked goods in order to raise enough cash to get back, and then in the Civil War she's denied recompense for her services to the Union, and then she's also denied a war widow's pension when her second husband passes, and who had fought in the Civil War for the Union. It's a tough life, right? And it's interesting now, a couple of years ago, well, not a couple actually, it was in Obama's presidency, that it was announced that Tubman was going to appear on the $20 note, and that is still, the legacy of Tubman has become, mythologized almost. The popular imagination has sort of quite rightly, sort of built her up, but sort of in ways that perhaps belie, the ways in which she might have been maligned by certain groups at the time, sort of, and, sort of ostracized as a black woman, right? Don't forget that, sort of many black women who were on the abolitionist circuit, who were on the women's rights campaign trails in the 19th century were sort of maligned for standing up and on a platform of abolition, and she faced dangers as a black woman. And I think both sort of sexual threats and illnesses, and we've already talked about the fact that she was hit in the head by an overseer who had a really bad aim, and from that she suffers throughout her whole life. So sort of life was not easy for Tubman, and I think and the fact that she rises above that and does all this philanthropic, brilliant work that is so focused on caring for others is just testament to how wonderful she is, and how rightfully she deserves her place among sort of the names such as Douglas, which I don't think she has quite sort of achieved yet. I mean, Douglas is the black abolitionist extraordinaire, right?
But I'm pleased that she does have a name recognition now. They say she broke the internet the day the Treasury announced that they might put her on the $20 bill. And I do want to say that there were hostilities after the war, that she did apply for a pension. She had many white patrons, including generals. They were questioning, where are her documents? Really, as a spy, as where were her documents? I mean, she had her own network. She used daguerreotype and pictures, and she knew who these people were. And if people could recognize them, they might be friends. So she cleverly used alternative methods. But it is true that finally in the 1890s, she received a pension that was not a full soldier's pension, more than a nurse's pension, but certainly topped up a widow's pension. And it was something that had been opposed for a long time by members of the South Carolina delegation to Congress, because they did not see her as a hero. And so I think it's very important to say now there's a Harriet Tubman Bridge, there are Harriet Tubman memorials, and indeed the need to recognize her for the great American patriot that she is. In the 1990s, for example, when American history standards were being established, she became the hot button. She became the trope that people used. Are we supposed to know about Harriet Tubman or George Washington? How can Harriet Tubman appear? So there is sexist, racist cant against her. But I think the children shall lead us. There were 20 children's books in print at the beginning of the 21st century. And when we study her life, we find an exemplar. We also have to recognize, Becky mentioned the injury, and I forgot to say that she has become a symbol of disability. She was, throughout her life, suffered spells. I have suggested she may have had narcolepsy. Others have said that she might have had a form of epilepsy. But whatever it was, she indeed was recognized by others as someone who was undertaking this dangerous work as a disabled person. But nevertheless, she thrived, she moved forward. And although we know she went to Boston to try to get help for her injuries, we don't have the medical records and can't trace them. But we do know that she was someone who's a symbol of overcoming physical disability, someone whose faith and someone whose resilience, I believe the word brilliantly put to her by Rebecca, is something, her resilience is what she teaches us.
And I mean, there's so much that we've covered in this episode that I think we need to unpack further. I think for now, that about wraps up everything we can cover in this episode. And I hope anyone listening has had a suitably fascinating insight into the life of Harriet Tubman. And I hope from this you want to find out tons more. And if you do, I've put loads of resources into the show notes so that you can do that. Thank you so much to our guests for this episode, Rebecca Fraser and Catherine Clinton. And if anyone wants to connect with either of you, where can they do that? Catherine?
You can go to my website, www.catherineclinton.com. It's very out of date, but nevertheless, anyone can write to me. email goes shooting through it. Thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Catherine. And Rebecca?
So on the UEA website, so University of East Anglia website, you'll find me if you search for me with email details, or alternatively, it's becky.fraser@uea.ac.uk.
Awesome. And you can find me on X via This Is The Hef, and on LinkedIn. Just search for Liam Heffernan because that's my name. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a rating and a review wherever you're listening to this, and give us a follow as well so that all future episodes appear in your feed. And if you want to support us further, you can head over to our Patreon page. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.